It was the kind of bitter cold morning that silenced even the birds, where frost bit at every windowpane and the horizon blurred with snow, when Clara Bell, a widowed farmer who had lived her whole life rooted to the same patch of Montana soil, saw something strange just beyond her barn. A black SUV twisted around a tree, steam curling from its crumpled hood, too new, too shiny, too out of place for these backroads. Clara, all flannel and faded denim, squinted through the snow, her instincts screaming that someone needed help, so she trudged forward through knee-deep drifts, her breath visible, boots crunching over frozen earth, and as she neared the wreck, she saw him, a man, unconscious, blood tracing a line down his forehead, the steering wheel bent from impact, and his suit, though soaked and torn, still screamed money. Clara didn't hesitate, didn't stop to ask questions. Just yanked open the jammed door with rough hands built from decades of farm work, pulled him out, and hauled him into her rickety old pickup truck like she'd done for sick calves and injured dogs, her heart beating fast but steady, driven not by heroism but humanity. She brought him back to her farmhouse, a simple, lived-in place with peeling paint and warm light, and laid him on the old leather couch by the fireplace, covering him with quilts stitched by her mother decades ago, the scent of wood smoke, stew, and soap filling the air as she worked to stop the bleeding, heat the room, and bring this stranger back from the brink. She didn't know his name yet, didn't care that he was Blake Harwood, the billionaire tech mogul who had reshaped industries and appeared on magazine covers, because out here, titles didn't matter, only decency did. For 3 long days, she nursed him back to life, feeding him broth, sponging his forehead, whispering prayers she'd stopped believing in since her husband died in a tractor accident 10 years ago, and her only son Ethan was killed in combat overseas. She sang old hymns in the kitchen while kneading bread, sometimes crying quietly over the sink, her grief woven into her days like threads in a worn sweater. But she never wavered in caring for the stranger, not because she expected anything in return, but because she'd been raised to do right, especially when no one's watching. When Blake finally woke up, dazed and weak, he found himself staring into the kindest, most weathered face he'd ever seen, and when he tried to rise and assert himself, to ask for a phone or offer money or explain who he was, Clara just smiled gently, placed a hand on his chest, and said, "You're safe." That's all that matters right now, and those words, so simple, pierced through layers of arrogance, exhaustion, and loneliness he didn't know he'd been carrying. As he slowly recovered, trapped on the farm by the storm that had shut down every road in and out of town, Blake began to see life through Clara's eyes, watching her rise before dawn to feed the animals, chop wood, mend fences, and check on neighbors by radio, her every movement infused with quiet purpose and care, even when no one was watching. He asked about her family, and she told him, voice steady but soft, about Ethan's childhood, his dreams, his bravery, and her husband James, who used to whistle while fixing the roof and always brought her wildflowers from the field. There was no bitterness in her stories, just a kind of acceptance, like a tree bent by years of wind but never broken. Blake was used to power, to people scrambling at his feet, to numbers and data and acquisitions. But here, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether the chickens had been fed, whether the firewood was dry, whether a lonely neighbor got a slice of pie on Sunday. As he slowly healed, body and mind, he started helping Clara, at first awkwardly, trying to lift hay bales or feed goats, fumbling with tools but grateful to be doing something real, something unfiltered. And in those long days, something inside him began to unravel. The walls he'd built through years of boardroom battles, betrayal, and loss started to fall. Brick by brick, replaced by a humility he didn't know he had. When the storm finally broke and the sheriff came to pick him up, Blake tried to thank Clara, to repay her, to write a check, but she just shook her head and said, "Pay it forward, that's how the world gets better." And with those words echoing in his ears, he left, but not really, because the farm, and the woman who saved him, stayed with him, stitched into the fabric of his soul. Back in New York, the city lights felt colder, the skyscrapers emptier, the meetings meaningless, and Blake found himself staring out windows thinking of sunrises over snowy fields and the sound of Clara humming in the kitchen. 2 weeks later, he cancelled his quarterly summit, ditched the suit, and flew back to Montana, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had found something more valuable than wealth. He knocked on Clara's door with 2 coffees in hand and a small velvet box in his coat. Inside was a land deed, 500 acres of leased land she'd never been able to afford to buy, now fully hers, debt-free, and when she opened it, she gasped, the coffee trembling in her hand, tears spilling before she could speak, but Blake just said, "It's not charity. It's what you deserve," and she, through teary laughter, said, "You are the most stubborn patient I've ever had," and invited him in without another word. From that day on, Blake became part of Clara's world. Not as a guest, but as a partner in every sense. He learned how to drive a tractor, plant corn, patch up fences, and host neighbors who came by just to share stories. He helped her set up a produce stand where struggling families could take what they needed without paying, created a mobile app to connect local farmers, funded a scholarship in Ethan's name, and transformed the barn into a community center where kids learned carpentry. Old folks danced to country music, and Clara finally had space to teach young women how to grow their own food. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, talking about the past, dreaming of the future, sometimes in silence, just sharing presence, and slowly, without fanfare, they healed each other. For all Blake had achieved, he never felt more alive than when he was covered in dirt, laughing beside Clara, who reminded him daily that purpose was worth more than profit. He no longer measured success in IPOs or quarterly gains but in acres planted, hands held, lives touched. Reporters caught wind of his transformation, calling it a redemption arc, a midlife crisis, a rebrand, but they didn't know the truth, didn't know that the real miracle was the woman who never asked for anything yet gave everything. Years passed, and the farm grew into a sanctuary, not just for crops, but for people, addicts in recovery, homeless veterans, single mothers, all found a second chance in Clara's kindness and Blake's vision, and together they built something beautiful. When Clara eventually passed, surrounded by the community she helped nurture, Blake was by her side, holding her hand as she whispered, "Keep planting. The world needs more growers," and he promised he would. He buried her beneath the cottonwood tree overlooking the field she loved most, where wildflowers now bloom in spring, and every year on her birthday, he returns with tea and a journal full of stories of the people she inspired. Her legacy, etched not in marble or monuments but in every seed sown in hope, lives on in the laughter of children at the farm, the hands of volunteers, and the heart of a man who had everything, but didn't know the value of life until a farmer taught him that sometimes the greatest riches are found not in what we own, but in what we give, and that one woman's quiet compassion could echo across generations, changing not just one life, but thousands, proving that love, steadfast, humble, and unconditional, is the most transformative force on earth.